The waiting area at Honolulu International buzzed with that peculiar energy found only in airports, half anticipation, half exhaustion. Among the crowd queued up for Pacific Airways Flight 782 to Los Angeles stood a woman who seemed to blend effortlessly into the backdrop. She wore a wide-brimmed straw sun hat, oversized sunglasses, and a relaxed linen shirt half tucked into faded jeans. She carried no flashy luggage, no loud accessories. A canvas duffel hung from her shoulder like it had been across continents. Too. Most people in line, she was just another tourist wrapping up a tropical getaway. She looked the part, skinned sun-kissed, lips chapped from salt air, and a worn paperback mystery novel clutched in one hand. Her boarding pass read, Emily Parker, and no one paid her much attention as she moved quietly through security and into the gate area. Emily was not like the other passengers. She wasn't lost in thought about meetings or school pickups or what to make for dinner. She wasn't scrolling through Instagram or balancing a latte in one hand and a phone in the other. She sat upright, legs crossed, scanning not obviously but subtly the room. Her eyes flicked to the exits, to the TSA agents, to the man 3 rows over whose nervous tapping hadn't stopped for 20 minutes. She cataloged it all like a machine. And yet, if you asked the gate agent who she remembered from boarding, Emily Parker wouldn't even crack the top 10. When her boarding hoop was called, she rose calmly and stepped forward, sliding into the stream of passengers. A young couple argued about seat assignments. A family wrangled 3 kids in a stroller. An older man grumbled at his boarding zone being skipped. Emily didn't react. She simply walked aboard, gave a gentle nod to the smiling flight attendant, and found her seat near the middle of the aircraft, 23B, an aisle seat. As she sat, she helped a young mother 2 rows up lift a bag into the overhead bin, earning a grateful smile. When the flight attendant passed by, Emily asked for a cup of water before takeoff, claiming a mild headache. But in truth, she just wanted an early gauge of the crew's attentiveness. In her lap, the paperback novel sat open, but her eyes weren't on the page. They were watching, measuring. A cabin filled quickly. The usual chorus of overhead bins slamming, babies fussing, and passengers navigating the awkward dance of stepping over legs to reach window seats. Emily remained relaxed, but alert. She noted a man in a business suit carrying an empty briefcase, odd for a Friday morning flight. She noted the elderly couple in 21A and 21B, both wearing oxygen sensors on their fingers. She noted the flight attendant with a slight limp favoring her left leg. None of it was cause for alarm, but Emily Parker didn't ignore details. She never had. As the plane began to taxi, she let out a soft breath and closed her eyes, sinking into the hum of the engines. She hadn't flown commercially in over a year, not since she had quietly retired from the cockpit. The irony wasn't lost on her. After nearly a decade of flying high-performance aircraft and commercial airliners, her first time back in the air was as a passenger. The truth was, Emily had needed a break. Her last assignment had left her emotionally threadbare. The stress, the bureaucracy, the memories. So Hawaii had seemed like the perfect escape. Sunsets, solitude, anonymity. She never expected that anonymity to be so thoroughly tested. Midway through ascent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Pacific Airways Flight 782 to Los Angeles. We're currently climbing to our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Weather's looking smooth all the way to Los Angeles, so sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. The usual smattering of applause came from somewhere in the back of the plane. Emily smirked faintly. The captain sounded young, confident, but maybe a little green. A cart rolled past offering drinks. Emily declined. She reached instead for the overhead light and turned it down slightly. Her hands, always steady, rested on her thighs. She had the reflexes of a fighter pilot, the bearing of a leader, and the silence of someone who had been through more than she ever spoke about. Flight 782
settled into cruise. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers unbuckled and shuffled to restrooms. Laptops opened. Conversations resumed. The lull of routine air travel returned. People were comfortable again. But Emily never got comfortable. Every 15 minutes, she subtly checked the clock, checked the wing flaps from her view down the aisle, checked the sound of the engines, Everything so far was normal. Smooth flight, friendly crew, quiet skies, until a faint vibration in her seat made her brow furrow. It was small, brief, but it wasn't random. She sat up straighter. That vibration wasn't turbulence, it was a system compensation. A trim correction, maybe. Or worse, a momentary flight path adjustment triggered by manual override, which shouldn't happen during cruise. Emily unclipped her belt slowly and leaned slightly into the aisle. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe nothing. But her instincts had never failed her. Then came the first overhead chime. The fasten seatbelt sign flicked back on, followed by an automated message. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign due to expected turbulence. Expected? Emily thought. That wasn't on the radar. The weather forecast had been clear. No storms, no jet stream turbulence, no sudden pressure drops. She sat back down but remained tense. 10 minutes passed. The plane lurched, dash hard. Gasps echoed throughout the cabin. Luggage thudded in overhead bins. A drink cart toppled at the back of the plane. Children cried. A man swore. Emily gripped the armrest, but not in fear. She was bracing herself. Her instincts flared hotter now. She looked around. Something wasn't right. Dot? She turned to the nearest flight attendant, who was hurrying back to her jump seat. Is everything okay up front? Emily asked calmly. Dot. The woman's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. I'm sure it's just turbulence, ma'am. Please stay seated. But Emily saw it in her face. The crew didn't know what was happening either. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door, which was still closed. A feeling washed over her. Not dread, but readiness. It was the same feeling she got seconds before combat training began. The same feeling before landing a crippled aircraft in a crosswind. She didn't know what was going on yet, but Emily Parker knew this much. This flight wasn't going to end the way it started. At 36,000 feet, over the deep blues of the Pacific Ocean, Flight 782 seemed to steady after the sudden lurch. Passengers whispered reassurances to each other, masks of nervous smiles reappearing, pretending it had all just been a rough patch of air. Flight attendants checked seatbelts and gave strained smiles. But Emily Parker didn't relax. She'd flown through turbulence before, real turbulence, a kind that flipped C-130 sideways. What just happened wasn't turbulence. It was a system shock, something initiated from within. It felt like a trim reset or a pitch correction done manually. Something was off with the flight controls. She watched the overhead lights. No alerts. The engines sounded normal, but they were pulling slightly harder, compensating for something. Thought. And then the real trouble began. A strange metallic thud echoed faintly through the fuselage. It was subtle, but unmistakable to a pilot's ear. Emily sat up straighter and scanned the cabin. Others noticed it too. Several heads turned. The young mother she'd helped earlier clutched her toddler closer. That's when a voice crackled from the intercom, distorted and clipped. This is the captain, experiencing a silence. Dot. Then static. Then nothing. The intercom went dead. Panic didn't explode immediately, but a creeping tension infected the air. People looked around, some laughing nervously. A man tried pressing the flight attendant call button. Another passenger stood up to go to the lavatory, only to be told to remain seated by a tight-lipped crew member. Emily noticed the flight attendants now, huddled by the galley, whispering quickly. Their eyes flicked toward the front of the plane. One of them reached for the phone, tried calling the cockpit, and waited. No response. The cockpit wasn't answering. Emily unclipped her seatbelt. The flight attendant nearest to her turned instantly. "Ma'am, please remain seated," she said in a firm but slightly quivering tone. Emily met her eyes. Calm, direct. "You're not getting a response from the flight deck, are you?" The woman froze. "We're handling it." "No, you're not," Emily said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Let me help." Before the attendant could argue further, the plane jerked again, harder than before. A tray flew from the galley. Someone screamed. Alarms faintly rang from the cockpit, too distant to decipher, but they were loud enough for Emily to hear. They weren't cabin alerts. They were system failure tones. She knew them well. Over the intercom came a rushed, shaky voice this time. A flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are currently experiencing a medical emergency. If there is a licensed pilot on board, we ask that you please make yourself known to the crew immediately." It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the cabin. Passengers turned, eyes wide. A hush rippled down the rows, and Emily Parker, the quiet woman in 23B, stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into her carry-on bag, pulled out a black nylon folder, and opened it for the flight attendant to see. Inside was a laminated federal pilot's license, along with the Department of Homeland Security ID. "I'm Captain Emily Parker, formerly with the Air Force and Pacific Skies Airlines, qualified on Boeing 737s, 747s, and Airbus 320s. I need access to the cockpit now." The attendant blinked, mouth open. You're really a pilot? "I'm your best shot at landing this aircraft now, please." The woman hesitated for only a second longer before pulling open the jump seat latch and leading her forward. Gasps followed her down the aisle. Emily ignored them. When she reached the cockpit door, she found the backup keypad already in emergency mode. The door was unlocked. Her heart sank a little. She pushed it open slowly, and what she saw would haunt her forever. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot was slumped in his seat, eyes closed, pale and sweating. The captain was still conscious, but barely. His skin was flushed red and shaking as he fumbled with controls, blinking rapidly. "Oxygen failure," the captain croaked, his words slurring. "Something's in the air vent." Emily moved fast. She hit the emergency override on the ventilation system and sealed the cockpit airflow. Then she pulled the backup oxygen mask from behind the seat and strapped it to the captain's face. But it was too late. He slumped sideways, unconscious. For a moment, everything was silent, just the hum of the engines and the rising tension of alarms echoing through the cockpit. Emily slid into the left seat. The controls were sluggish. The autopilot had disconnected, and the plane was veering slightly south of its planned course toward restricted military airspace. She glanced at the navigation panel. No response from Los Angeles Center. She tried the radio. Black Center. "This is Flight 782, declaring emergency." "Repeat, this is Flight 782. Both pilots incapacitated. Requesting immediate emergency vector. Do you copy?" Static. Her fingers moved fast across the switches, flipping to emergency frequencies. Finally, a distant voice responded. "Flight 782, say again, who's on the mic?" "This is Captain Emily Parker, licensed FAA commercial pilot, now assuming command of Pacific Airways Flight 782. I'm flying solo. Situation on board includes dual pilot incapacitation. Possible toxic event. Request vector to nearest viable landing strip." A long pause. "Copy that. Flight 782, we're alerting emergency services and diverting you to Edwards Air Force Base. Repeat, Edwards is your best option. Are you able to maintain altitude?" Emily looked over the panels. The main autopilot was out. Manual flight mode only. Some of the hydraulic assist functions were sluggish, but the engines were holding. Fuel was tight but manageable. "I can hold altitude for now," she replied, "but I'll need a straight descent approach. I don't trust the controls for a steep vector." Back in the cabin, the passengers were no longer whispering. They were wide-eyed, gripping armrests, staring at the closed cockpit door. The intercom remained silent for another full minute before it finally clicked on again. A new voice came through. Firm, clear, unshaken. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Parker speaking.
We've experienced a medical emergency in the cockpit. I've assumed command of the aircraft and will be flying us to an emergency landing site at Edwards Air Force Base in California. I need you to remain calm and follow all instructions from the cabin crew. We are in control." The cabin erupted, not in panic, but in pure silence. They listened. They obeyed. Because whoever Emily Parker was, she sounded like she'd done this before. And deep down, everyone on board sensed the same truth. She was the reason they still had a chance. Inside the cockpit of Flight 782, Emily Parker sat in the captain's seat, hands steady on the controls, eyes flicking between gauges, screens, and switches, with the trained precision of someone who had done this more times than she could count. The entire cockpit deck had gone silent, except for the intermittent drone of warnings and the soft rasp of oxygen flowing from her mask. The co-pilot remained slumped in his chair, unconscious but breathing. The captain, still dazed, had been pulled into the observer seat, his head supported with a rolled-up jacket. Emily had managed to stabilize the plane's pitch and altitude, but the plane's main autopilot was fried, and several navigation instruments had flickered out completely. A cascading systems fault, she suspected, had started with the same toxic leak that had knocked the pilots out. She glanced over the backup navigation screen. The data was still holding, though sluggish. The aircraft had drifted miles off course during the last 20 minutes, heading toward restricted airspace and setting off alerts on the FAA radar tracking system, which meant eyes were already on her, likely military ones. She tapped into the emergency channel again. Flight 782 to LAX Center. Confirm emergency landing vector to Edwards Air Force Base. I need weather, runway availability, and emergency response status. A voice came back more focused this time. Captain Parker, Edwards is clear. Runway 22L is being cleared for immediate priority landing. Winds are 5 knots north. Paramedics and hazmat teams are standing by. Confirm souls on board. 320, she replied without hesitation. Repeat 320. Fuel level at approximately 9,400 pounds. Aircraft is airworthy, but compromised. Copy that. We're tracking you. You have control. She already knew that. Back in the cabin, the mood had shifted from confusion to a brittle silence, the kind that fills the air when people are teetering between fear and awe. The passengers of Flight 782 had heard Emily's voice come through the intercom only once since the emergency began. But that single transmission had changed everything. It was like someone had flipped the switch. Panic had drained out of the cabin, replaced by anxious quiet. They had no idea who was flying the plane now. The name Emily Parker meant nothing to them, but her voice carried certainty, a kind of certainty no commercial pilot training could teach. In row 18, a teenager whispered to his dad, "Did you see her get up? She didn't even look scared." A few rows back, the elderly man with the cane muttered, "She walked down that aisle like she owned the damn sky." Near the back, the flight attendants were checking in with each other, moving between rows, calming passengers, distributing oxygen masks just in case. One of them, a young woman named Brielle, had seen Emily's credentials up close. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head. She just stood up and said she was a pilot, just like that. And the thing was, they believed her instantly. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't panicked, she hadn't even hesitated. Emily Parker had walked into the cockpit with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen worse and lived to tell the tale. But who exactly was she? Inside the cockpit, Emily took a deep breath. It was time. She switched the intercom back on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Parker again. I want to update you on our current status. We've rerouted our flight path to Edwards Air Force Base. I am manually flying the aircraft, and we're on
Course for a safe emergency landing in approximately 27 minutes. The cabin crew is trained and capable. Please remain calm and follow all directions." There was a pause. Then she added with deliberate clarity, "I have over 10,000 flight hours. I am certified on Boeing and Airbus platforms. I'm a former Air Force pilot. You are in good hands." The words dropped like stones into a still lake, in row after row. Passengers turned to each other, eyebrows raised, mouths open. Air Force. A real fighter pilot on this flight. It sounded like something out of a movie. For Emily, the announcement was more than reassurance. It was a decision. She had spent years avoiding attention, stepping out of the spotlight after a decade of deployments, near misses, and classified missions. There had been a time when her name was whispered in Air Force briefings. Ghost Hawk, they used to call her. Precision under pressure. The pilot who never cracked. The one who landed a crippled F-15 after it took missile damage over the Syrian border. But after losing her wingman during a mission gone sideways, she had walked away quietly. No farewell tour, no press releases, just a transfer to a low-profile security role in aviation operations. She hadn't flown an aircraft in months, and now, here she was, back in the sky. Thousands of lives in her hands again, not by choice, but by instinct. 20 minutes to landing, the control panel flickered again, a low-running chimed hydraulic system 2 showing partial pressure loss. Emily's hands moved automatically, checking redundancy lines, routing actuator control to System 1B. The aircraft responded, but slowly. It would be like landing a brick through wind shear. She'd have to fight it the whole way down. Edwards Tower, this is Flight 782, hydraulic failure on System 2. Request emergency brake assist and tow on arrival. Landing will be heavy. The reply came without delay. Affirmative. 782. Brake net is being deployed. Fire and rescue on standby. She'd landed fighters with wing damage and 30 fuel windows. She could do this. But what weighed heavier than the aircraft was the thought, what if I hadn't been on this flight? The flight crew had begun to regain composure. One of the male attendants, Scott, approached the cockpit cautiously and spoke through the door. "Captain Parker, is there anything we can do?" Emily opened the door slightly. Her face was flushed, a thin sheen of sweat on her brow. "Yes, keep the cabin calm and have your strongest attendants in place during landing. We might come in hard." Scott nodded. "And one more thing," Emily added, eyes narrowing slightly. "You might hear some chatter outside. Fighter jets. Don't worry, they're just watching." Indeed, 2 sleek F-16s had appeared beside Flight 782, one on each wing. Their pilots could see straight through the cockpit glass, and what they saw surprised them. Instead of a panicked civilian or a struggling flight attendant, they saw a woman in full control, flipping switches and guiding the aircraft like she'd flown it her whole life, which in many ways she had. 17 minutes to touchdown. Emily gripped the yoke, adjusted her heading, and watched the desert below begin to take shape. She wasn't just a tourist anymore. She was the difference between a tragedy and a miracle, and 320 people now knew her name. Altitude 29,000 feet, descent rate 1,200 feet per minute, time to Edwards Air Force Base 16 minutes. Emily Parker stared at the instrument panel, her hands a blur of deliberate movements as she adjusted the aircraft's heading and manually rebalanced the trim. The hydraulic pressure in System 2 continued to drop. The aircraft was responding, barely. Every correction felt like trying to steer a stubborn freight train on ice. One wrong move, and she'd overshoot the airbase. One wrong pitch, and the flaps could jam. But she didn't let the fear in, not now. She'd learned long ago how to fly through fear in combat. It wasn't the lack of fear that kept you alive, it was your ability to act despite it. She'd been a 26-year-old Air Force captain during her first combat mission, dodging surface-to-air missiles over a no-fly zone while trying to keep a wingman alive. Compared to that day, this was calm seas, mostly. A warning light blinked again, this time a cabin pressure alert, not a major drop, but enough to activate the automatic outflow valve. Emily responded instantly, opening a backup control panel and adjusting the rate to stabilize the pressure. The cockpit hissed as the airflow changed. She glanced toward the unconscious co-pilot, still stable, breathing, but pale. The captain, now slightly conscious, groaned behind her. Emily didn't turn to him. She couldn't afford the distraction. Her focus was on the next 10 minutes and the last 10,000 feet. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. There was no screaming, no chaos, no shouting passengers demanding answers. Instead, there was something more unnerving, a quiet waiting tension.
like 320 people were collectively holding their breath. The intercom had been silent for nearly 5 minutes. The only real sound came from the hum of the engines and the rustling of oxygen mask packets being handed out row by row. The flight attendants were doing their best, but they weren't trained for this. Not for fighter jets escorting their plane. Not for watching their passengers scan the window and spot emergency lights waiting on the ground. In seat 14D, a tech executive named Harrison sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. Across the aisle, a nervous teenager kept glancing at the cabin door as if he expected someone to walk out and tell him it was all a prank. But it was. Tint. At the very front of the aircraft, Flight Attendant Brielle took a deep breath and lifted the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our emergency descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened, place your tray tables up, and your seats in the upright position. Stay seated and do not block the aisles. You may feel some heavy braking and noise as we land. Remain calm." A few heads turned toward the cockpit. They were all thinking the same thing. Who was flying this plane? Emily's eyes flicked to the HUD. She was flying with partial avionics, now half the readings lagging by a second or two, just enough to force her to rely on gut instinct. She dialed in the new heading, 084, slight crosswind. Runway 22L was long, over 15,000 feet, and it would need to be. The emergency crew on the ground had prepared brake nets at the end of the runway just in case. Edwards Tower, this is Flight 782, altitude now at 19,000 feet. Request clearance for straight-in approach. Flight 782, cleared for final. Runway 22L is all yours. Emergency team standing by. Fighter escort will break off at 5 miles. She could feel her pulse finally slow and deliberate. Her fingers tightened around the yoke. Almost there, but the hardest part was still to come. The descent steepened as Emily adjusted flaps and calibrated thrust, careful not to overcorrect. Any sudden movement could blow the weakened hydraulics completely. Another warning light. Flap deployment error. She swore under her breath. The flaps on the right wing hadn't fully extended. They were stuck at 22 degrees while the left sat at 30. She'd have asymmetrical lift on approach. Recipe for disaster. But she could still do it if she kept the approach stable and didn't fight the aircraft's natural tendency to pull right. It would mean adjusting the rudder manually during the final 2 minutes. Tricky. Not impossible. She just needed room, focus, and a lot of calm passengers. Back in the cabin, Scott, the lead flight attendant, walked down the aisle slowly, checking belts. He stopped at Emily's now empty seat. Her carry-on was still tucked under it. He noticed something sticking out of the bag, a folded photograph. Scott glanced around. No one was watching. He reached down and pulled the photo just far enough to see it. Emily, years younger, standing beside a fighter jet in full Air Force gear, helmet under one arm. Beside her was a man in the same uniform. They were laughing. Brothers in arms. On the back, faded pen writing. "We made it out. For now." Scott slipped it back inside and blinked hard. He returned to his jump seat and grabbed the intercom. "Folks, we'll be landing soon. You may hear some unusual sounds. Don't be alarmed. We've got a veteran pilot in control. The best kind. Just stay buckled. We're almost home." Altitude 8,000 feet. Distance to runway 14 miles. Through the clouds, the California
desert began to emerge, flat, golden, harsh, and in the distance, a wide gray stripe of safety. Emily aligned the aircraft with runway 22L. Flight 782 cleared to land. Winds holding. You're clear to brake hard. Emily adjusted trim again. Her right hand held steady on the throttle, left guiding the yoke as she fought the asymmetry. The flaps rattled in protest. Hydraulics moaned. Her right foot braced harder. On the rudder, she didn't blink. At Edwards, emergency teams lined both sides of the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, security vehicles, hazmat units. The radio chatter had gone silent, all eyes and ears now focused on the silver Pacific Airways plane making its way through the sky like a ghost refusing to fall. 2 fighter jets peeled off and disappeared behind distant ridgelines. The sky was Emily's alone now. "Cabin crew, brace for landing," Emily said over the intercom, voice cool and measured. Dot. In the cabin, the flight attendants echoed the message. "Brace! Brace! Heads down! Stay down!" Passengers gripped armrests, eyes shut, prayers whispered, teeth clenched. Dot. In the cockpit, Emily leveled the aircraft just above the runway. "Come on," she whispered. Dotch eased the nose down. The landing gear screamed as it met the concrete. The plane bounced once, hard, but then settled. She hit the manual brakes, holding with everything she had. The aircraft groaned, vibrating as it slowed, tires smoking. Dot. The brake net at the runway's end loomed ahead. 10 seconds. 5.2 dots. Stop. The aircraft shuddered, groaned, and finally came to a halt just 20 feet from the net. Dot. Silence. Then, inside the cabin, a child cried. And then came the sound Emily hadn't expected to hear. Applause. For a full 5 seconds after the aircraft came to a complete stop, Flight 782 remained eerily silent. No screaming, no celebration, no rushing to unbuckle seat belts. It was the silence of disbelief. 320 passengers frozen between shock and salvation, trying to understand what had just happened. They were alive. They had landed, but nothing about it felt real yet. In the cockpit, Emily Parker exhaled slowly, her hands clenched on the yoke, finally released. Her shoulders ached from the tension, her shirt stuck to her back. She pulled off the oxygen mask and leaned her head back against the seat, eyes fluttering shut. Dot. She had done it, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins, and she knew they weren't finished yet. Emily turned toward the co-pilot, still unconscious but stable. The captain behind her was more alert now, groaning as he came to. She gave him a look. "You're okay," she said. "Stay seated. Help's coming." The captain blinked, trying to process what was happening. "You landed." Emily nodded, already toggling the radio. "Edwards Tower, this is Flight 782. Aircraft is down. Repeat, we are safely down. Request immediate medical personnel on board. 2 pilots incapacitated. No injuries reported in the cabin yet." "Copy that, 782. Emergency crews are on the way. Sit tight." Outside, rescue vehicles raced down the runway, sirens blaring in unison, fire trucks, ambulances, hazmat units. It looked like a war zone response, bright red suits, heavy masks, portable oxygen tanks. This was no routine landing. The aircraft had been tagged for a potential onboard contamination. Dot. Inside the cabin, passengers began to stir. One voice whispered, "We're alive." Another, "Did we really just land?" The tension shattered as people realized they had survived. Tears flowed. Someone sobbed audibly. A woman shouted, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Then the applause erupted again, louder this time, contagious. Seat backs banged as people clapped. Some were crying, others were laughing hysterically, and all of them were staring at the cockpit door because the woman who had flown the plane hadn't emerged out yet. Back in the aisle, Scott, the lead flight attendant, unstrapped himself from his jump seat and rushed toward the cockpit. He knocked once before slowly opening the door. Dot. Inside, Emily was still at the controls, as if her body didn't trust the landing had actually happened. Scott's voice was soft. "Captain Parker, you did it." Emily didn't smile. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the instruments once more, old habits. "Are the emergency crews boarding?" she asked. "They're rolling stairs up now. Medics are on standby. Start disembarkation from the back. Keep people seated up front until hazmat gets to the flight deck. We don't know what knocked them out." Scott hesitated. "The passengers. They want to see you to thank you." Emily finally looked up, the steel in her expression softening, her voice lowered. "Right now, they need safety and order more than closure. Let's get them off the plane. Then I'll talk."
Scott nodded and turned to leave, pausing only to say, "They'll never forget you." 10 minutes later, the rear doors opened and fresh air poured into the cabin like a blessing. Flight attendants carefully coordinated rows of passengers, guiding them down portable stairs to a designated quarantine zone on the tarmac. Paramedics stood ready with stretchers, assisting the elderly and checking for signs of trauma. Each person that stepped off the plane looked back once, not at the runway, but at the aircraft itself, at the cockpit window, at the shape of a woman's silhouette behind the glass. "She saved us," one man said simply. "Whoever she is, she saved us." On the ground, a military officer in full uniform arrived on scene, flanked by an Air Force base commander and a medical director. They approached the aircraft with urgency and reverence. One of them held a printout. Emily's credentials had already hit their desk. "Captain Emily Parker," the officer muttered, scanning the name. "I'll be damned. You know her?" a commander asked. "She flew recon over Helmand Province. Ghost Hawk, they called her. Never thought I'd hear that name again." Inside the cockpit, Emily finally stood. The ground crew had boarded. Medics had taken over the cockpit area, tending to the pilot and co-pilot. Hazmat teams were preparing to test the airflow system. The cabin was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers being processed at the door. Emily stepped into the aisle and walked slowly toward the exit. As she reached the threshold, she stopped and turned back. Rows of empty seats, tray tables half up, forgotten earbuds, baby blankets, books, lives, a floating city that had been on the brink and survived. She closed her eyes for a beat and walked off the plane. On the tarmac, the press had already gathered. Somehow, word had gotten out. A few still shots of her silhouette through the cockpit window had leaked, and in the age of live feeds, truth travels faster than flight. But she didn't stop for cameras. She didn't wave or pose. She walked directly to the medical team, gave her statement, and insisted on being the last to be processed. She stood quietly beside the mobile command vehicle, watching passengers being handed bottles of water, comforted, counted, and loaded into buses bound for temporary shelters. Then someone tapped her on the shoulder. It was Briel, the young flight attendant. "Captain Parker, I just wanted to say, you held your crew together. That's not nothing." "We all thought you were just a tourist," Briel said, blinking back tears. Emily looked out at the desert, the runway, the plane. Some tourists carry more baggage than others. Hours later, when the passengers had gone, the debris cleared, and the sun dipped below the horizon, a man in a navy blue suit approached her with a clipboard, FAAA. He handed her a report form and asked for her official statement. She filled it out in silence. When she reached the line marked "Position on Flight 782, she paused, then wrote, "Passenger, emergency pilot in command." He looked at her as if he didn't know whether to salute or shake her hand. Emily just handed back the form and said, "Next time, maybe double-check the cockpit air systems." He nodded, noted. Far away, as the evening news ran footage of Flight 782's miraculous landing, anchors used words like hero, mystery pilot, Air Force legend. But Emily didn't watch the coverage. She sat in a folding chair beside the hangar, sipping a bottle of water, staring at the stars. She had once walked away from the sky, convinced she'd never return, but today the sky had called her name, and she'd answered, not as a tourist, but as a pilot. The emergency was over.
Storm was just beginning. By the time Emily Parker returned to the temporary holding center where passengers and crew were being debriefed, her name was no longer a secret. Someone had connected the dots between the passenger manifest, military records, and the leaked air traffic control logs. A few sharp-eyed journalists had pieced together who had saved Flight 782, and just like that, the Ghost Hawk had a face again. Emily sat in a corner of the makeshift command post, watching a looping feed of news anchors discussing the incident in real time.
An unidentified passenger took control of the aircraft after both pilots were incapacitated. ... Former military, decorated service. ... Double quotes. ... Call sign, Ghost Talk, believed to have retired quietly 5 years ago. Her phone, long powered off and buried in her bag, was probably full of messages. She had been out of the public eye since the day she walked away from the Air Force, swearing she'd never fly again. And now, the world suddenly wanted to know everything, not because she asked for it, but because she survived it. "Captain Parker," a calm voice called. She looked up. A man in his 40s, clean-cut, navy blazer, stepped forward. His badge identified him as Daniel Reyes, senior investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB. "I'm here to ask a few questions, off the record for now. We're trying to piece together exactly what happened in that cockpit." Emily stood, stretching slightly. She nodded toward a small, private room. "Let's do it in there." Once the door closed, Daniel pulled out a digital recorder, clicked it on, and placed it on the table. "Name for the record." "Captain Emily Parker, U.S. Air Force, retired. You were listed as a passenger on Flight 782. "Yes, 14A, left window seat, economy class." She smirked. "Not as roomy as the cockpit." Daniel smiled, appreciating her dry humor. "Walk me through what happened, from your perspective, starting from when you realized something was wrong." Emily leaned back in her chair, hands relaxed on her thighs. "The first signal was the sudden silence in the cockpit. We were mid-cruise, but the aircraft veered slightly. The autopilot should have compensated. Then I noticed flight attendants whispering, clearly unsure. When no announcement came from the captain, I stood up. She gave him the full sequence, the smell of ozone, the jammed cockpit door, her brief confrontation with the flight attendant, the unconscious crew, and the exact moment she took the controls. "You've flown commercial before?" Daniel asked. "Simulated." "Yes, I trained in multi-engine conversions during my last year of service. Once you've flown an F-15 through anti-air fire, an Airbus is intimidating. It's like trading a knife fight for a chess match." Daniel blinked. "So, you'd say the aircraft systems failed due to air circulation anomaly. Possibly chemical or electrical fault. My guess, a slow leak from auxiliary electronics beneath the cockpit floor. Short exposure wouldn't take out the crew instantly, but prolonged breathing in those fumes would cause unconsciousness." He scribbled notes. "And you landed with partial flaps, compromised hydraulics, and a 15-degree yaw." "Yes." Daniel looked up. "That's borderline impossible." Emily shrugged. "It was a good day for miracles." After the debrief, she stepped out into the crisp desert evening. A light breeze kicked up dust along the edge of the runway, and in the distance, the tail of Flight 782 loomed like a grounded bird. And that's when she heard the voice. "Captain Parker." Emily turned. A young woman in civilian clothes holding a press badge jogged toward her. Her name tag read, "Maya Lin, freelance reporter for a national news outlet." "I've been trying to reach you since the landing," Maya said, breathless. "Can I just ask, why didn't you reveal yourself sooner? Why keep it a secret?" Emily crossed her arms. "Because I wasn't there to be anyone's hero. I was just taking a break from being one." Maya tilted her head. "But your service record is legendary. Combat sorties, hostage rescues. You were nominated for the Distinguished Flying Cross twice." "And I walked away because I couldn't keep watching friends go down in flames. I came back stateside and never looked back until yesterday." Maya paused, caught off guard by the rawness in Emily's tone. "I didn't get on that plane to be remembered," Emily said quietly. "I just didn't want anyone to be forgotten." And she walked away. By nightfall, the base had settled. Passengers were resting in arranged hotels, engineers were tearing apart the cockpit, and investigators were reviewing flight data. Emily had no orders to stay, but the Air Force commander had offered her an empty barracks room. Quiet, no press. She accepted. Inside the room smelled like linoleum and dust. Just a bed, a desk, and an old photo tacked to the wall of a squadron from 20 years ago. She lay down without changing clothes. Her body ached, but her mind stayed alert. Somewhere beyond that door, the world was learning her name again.
But here, she was just Emily. The next morning, a man she hadn't seen in years arrived at the base. Colonel Ray Mercer, her former commanding officer. Grizzled, hard-edged, still carried his coffee like a weapon, but his eyes softened when he saw her. "Hell of a landing, Parker," he said, arms crossed. "Didn't know you still had it in ya." She gave him a tired smile. I didn't know either. They walked along the tarmac in silence for a minute. Then he stopped and pulled something from his jacket. Her old wings, the original metal insignia. She turned in the day she retired. "You earned these twice now. Maybe it's time you stopped running from the sky." Emily took them gently, the weight familiar in her palm. "I wasn't running. I was just tired of crashing." Colonel Mercer nodded. "Well, the Air Force is reviewing what happened. The FAA too. But there's already talk. Recommendations, citations, maybe even an official commendation. You won't be anonymous for long." Emily looked down at the wings. Her name had returned to the sky, whether she was ready or not. The hotel room was quiet, but Emily Parker couldn't sleep. She hadn't slept much since the landing, not because she was anxious, but because the noise had shifted. It was no longer the hum of jet engines or the buzz of comms in her headset. Now, it was the relentless roar of attention. 3 days had passed since she safely landed Flight 782. In those 72 hours, her face had been on every major news network. Phrases like mystery military pilot, real-life hero, modern-day Sully had been splashed across headlines. She had gone from tourist to worldwide icon overnight, and she hated every second of it. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand again. She didn't check it. Dozens of voicemails, hundreds of texts, interviews, morning shows, offers for book deals. Every military contact she hadn't heard from in years had reached out. Old squad mates, commanders, even a few politicians. Everyone had something to say. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. But what they didn't understand was that Emily never did any of it to be remembered. She had saved 320 people because it was what she knew how to do, because someone had to, because she could. She hadn't done it for applause and certainly not for fame. At 8 a.m., there was a knock on her hotel door. Emily opened it to find Briel, the young flight attendant from Flight 782. She held 2 coffees and an envelope. "Thought you might need this," Briel said, offering the drink. "And this." Inside the envelope was a letter signed by all the passengers from the flight. Dozens of handwritten notes, some scribbled in shaky penmanship, others in neat cursive. Some had included photos. One child had drawn a picture of the plane with Emily standing on top, arms outstretched like a superhero. Emily swallowed hard. "I don't know how to say thank you enough," Briel said. "So I'll just say this. I'm applying to flight school. You reminded me why I love the sky." Emily looked up at her, eyes wet. "You'll be a damn good pilot." Later that morning, she was escorted to an Air Force briefing, not as an officer, but as a guest of Hunter. The commander's office had been converted into a press-free zone with strict orders to keep out media until the debrief concluded. Colonel Mercer greeted her at the door. "Parker," he said with his usual gravel voice, "you're trending. Higher than the Super Bowl."
She groaned. "Exactly the nightmare I was trying to avoid." He chuckled, then grew serious. "You've been requested to speak before the FAA board next week. Also, the Pentagon's looking into a special commendation, somewhat to make this national news." Emily crossed her arms. "It already is." "Yes, but we're talking legacy stuff. Public honors, memorials, maybe even a reinstatement ceremony." Emily stiffened. "I'm not coming back, Colonel. I did what I had to do. It doesn't mean I want to wear the uniform again." "I know," he said quietly, "but the world's not asking you to. It's just trying to thank you. Let it." Meanwhile, the world outside would not calm down. Journalists camped outside her hotel. Her parents were hounded by reporters in Ohio. A publishing house emailed her a draft book proposal titled "The Passenger Who Landed Flight 782. Even a Hollywood agent reached out claiming rights to a biopic.
Emily ignored them all. The only people she agreed to speak with were the passengers. One night, she hosted a closed-door gathering at a nearby community center, where over 100 survivors from the flight reunited. There were hugs, tears, and long, quiet moments of shared understanding. No one tried to take selfies. No one live-streamed. They just said, "Thank you." A woman in her 70s approached Emily with a trembling voice. "I was flying to see my grandson. He was born the day before the flight. I would have never met him if it weren't for you." Emily didn't reply. She simply hugged her. Another man, ex-military, offered a salute. "You reminded me what valor really looks like." Despite the chaos, the investigation moved fast. The NTSB confirmed a slow leak in the avionics bay, which had released odorless neurotoxic fumes into the cockpit. The ventilation system failed to redirect it, and both pilots were overcome. A sensor meant to detect this malfunction had been disconnected during recent maintenance. It could have easily been catastrophic. That if Emily hadn't intervened when she did, the plane would have likely run out of fuel or veered off course, crashing somewhere over uninhabited desert. Her decision to act had saved every soul on board. The FAA called her in for a formal statement. The hearing was recorded but kept private at her request. She answered every technical question in detail. No dramatics, no embellishments. When asked if she felt like a hero, she gave the same answer every time. "I did what any trained pilot would do. I just wasn't supposed to be on duty that day." By the end of the week, Emily had only one destination left: home. Her flight back to Ohio was booked under an alias, but somehow the airline staff still recognized her. The gate agent whispered, "Thank you," as she passed. The captain of the flight came out to greet her before takeoff. "Can't tell you what it means to us." "What you did," he said. Emily simply nodded. "Just fly safe." Back home, she stepped inside her modest townhouse and finally breathed deeply, quietly, completely. The silence was no longer heavy. It was earned. Her living room was just as she'd left it. A shelf of old medals she never looked at, a dusty flight jacket in the closet, a photo of her and her old squadron on the wall. She placed the envelope from the passengers next to the photo and added something else to the shelf: her wings. Not because she was returning to duty, because she had remembered who she was. Not a mystery, not a myth, just a woman who still knew how to fly. It had been 6 weeks since the emergency landing of Flight 782. Emily Parker no longer checked the news, not because she wasn't curious, but because she knew how the world worked. Heroes came and went, stories burned bright then faded. People moved on. The headlines had changed from ghost talk resurfaces to FAA investigates systemic failures to passenger flights resume normal operations. And Emily, she was back in her hometown. But normal was no longer something she believed in. Her quiet life had returned, but it didn't feel the same. Every time she passed the small local airfield just outside of town, she slowed down. Not to visit, just to look, just to remember. Flying had once been everything to her. Then it became a scar. Now somehow it was calling again. One Thursday morning, she sat in the corner of her favorite coffee shop, leafing through a local paper, when a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You always sit like that. Legs half crossed, left thumb drumming on the table?" She looked up and smiled. Briel, the flight attendant from Flight 782, stood in front of her with a duffel bag and tired eyes. Emily rose and hugged her. "You didn't say you were coming." "I didn't know until last night," Briel said. "I had an interview, flight school entrance exam in Dayton." Emily grinned. "Told you'd be a damn good pilot." "They said the same thing. I start next month." They walked through the nearby park, a stretch of open green scattered with kids, cyclists, and old couples feeding birds. It reminded Emily of why she had always loved the ground, but also why the sky had always pulled her back. "Still have dreams about it," Briel admitted. "About the flight. Not nightmares, just flashes, the alarms, the tilt of the cabin, your voice over the intercom. Emily nodded. It doesn't leave you. It just settles in. Brielle looked at her. Do you miss it? Emily paused. Then, every day. That night, Emily sat at her desk and finally did what she had been avoiding. She opened the emails, hundreds of them, some from passengers, others from pilots, strangers, veterans, flight school cadets. People shared their fears, their thanks, their trauma, their hope. One message came from a teenage girl who had been terrified of flying her whole life. But after reading about you, I told my parents I want to take my first flight. If you were on that plane, I know I'd be safe. You made the sky feel like home. Emily stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she closed the laptop. 3 days later, she returned to the airfield. This time, not to watch, gotta fly. A small Cessna 172 sat at the far end of the runway, and beside it stood Tommy, a retired flight instructor she'd once trained with during her post-service civilian transition. Are you sure about this? He asked, handing her the headset dog. Emily tightened the strap and slid into the pilot's seat. The engine roared to life. Her hands found the controls like they'd never left. The runway stretched ahead, and as she accelerated, the old thrill sparked in her chest again. Takeoff. Smooth, effortless, inevitable. From 5,000 feet, the town looked small and soft, the sky endless. Emily leveled out and laughed into the radio. Tommy's voice crackled. Still got it? She smiled. Never lost it. The Air Force had sent one final letter weeks earlier, a formal commendation, quiet, respectful, and deeply personal. It acknowledged her actions as critical to the preservation of 320 lives and offered her a ceremonial return to service if she ever wanted it. She never replied, not because she was refusing it, but because she knew something no one else did. She didn't need the uniform anymore to prove who she was. The wings lived inside her now. A month later, she gave her first public talk, not to the media, not to a panel of generals, but to a room full of aviation students at a small flight academy. She stood in front of them in jeans and a simple leather jacket. No medals, no spotlight, just Emily, and she told them the truth. Not about fear, about instinct, about how flying wasn't about ego or adrenaline. It was about responsibility, about the people in the back of the plane, about what it meant to be trusted with lives. She ended with a single line. When the worst happened, I didn't save the plane because I was a hero. I saved it because I refused to let it fly it into the ground. The room was silent. Then came the applause. In the weeks that followed, Emily accepted a part-time role mentoring young pilots. She refused all TV appearances, turned down every book deal, and gave no interviews. But the story spread anyway, not because she pushed it, but because others did. The passengers carried it, the crew shared it, and strangers remembered it. She had become a symbol, even without trying. But more than that, she had become herself again. One autumn morning, 6 months after the emergency landing of Flight 782, she stood outside the same gate at LAX where Flight 782 had first boarded. A little boy ran past her, laughing, pulling his rolling suitcase like a race car. His mother chased after him, smiling nervously. Emily looked up at the flight board. Different flight, different destination, but the same sky waited outside. A gate agent passed by, did a double take, and paused. Wait, you're the one from that flight. The pilot, the tourist turned hero, right? Emily smiled softly. I was never just a tourist. And with that, she picked up her small bag, walked toward the windows overlooking the runway, and watched a plane rise into the clouds. Not with fear, not with regret, but with pride, because the sky wasn't behind her. It was still hers. The end. Up at the flight board. Different flight, different destination, but the same sky waited outside. A gate agent passed by, did a double take, and paused. Wait, you're the one from that flight. The pilot, the tourist turned hero, right? Emily smiled softly. I was never just a tourist. And with that, she picked up her small bag, walked toward the windows overlooking the runway, and watched a plane rise into the clouds. Not with fear, not with regret, but with pride, because the sky wasn't behind her. Dot. It was still hers. The end.
If you like our video, then like and subscribe our channel for daily realistic videos.